in the beginning of the 119th Congress, there was a lot of laws that were passed because of the Congressional Review Act, which were essentially regulation killers. So out of the 34 new laws, 16 of them, almost half of the new laws, were regulation killers. Congress passed SJ Res 28, and this is a regulation killer that has to do with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What Congress did is they killed a regulation by the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection that would have policed digital payment applications just like any bank is policed. And so what this did in reality is that this essentially exempts Apple Pay and Google Pay and Cash App and PayPal and Venmo, all those type of apps from Consumer Financial Protection Bureau policing, allowing them to escape accountability. That certainly doesn't protect me, the user, but it does protect them, which I think shows us pretty clearly who our members of Congress are currently serving.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 322nd episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today, we are going to look at what Congress accomplished in the first 8 months of the year before they took off on their 5-week summer vacation. Because it's not like this executive branch needs oversight or anything. So yeah, of course they should take 5 weeks off while DC gets invaded by the National Guard and stuff. But yeah, Congress is coming back to work after Labor Day. And so before they get back, I do want to let you know what they actually accomplished this year so far. We have 34 new laws. We have a lot of Trump administration officials who got confirmed, and there are some characters. So we're going to look at who those characters are. I'll let you know what the Democrats have been up to. And then we should be good to go for the fall, which is always an adventure in Congress. And I expect nothing different this year because, once again, Congress has to fund the government by September 30th, and they are nowhere near done with that job. And so we have some government funding crises in our near future. And so let's get this out of the way before we get into crisis season. But if you're not yet supporting Congressional Dish, I do want to let you know a little bit more about these last week in Congress episodes that we have been producing for our Patreon supporters, because this episode is really a summary of the 20 plus last week in Congress episodes that I have produced so far this year for the people who are paying for this show. And so you're actually going to hear portions of the previously recorded Last Week in Congress episodes today, especially in the confirmations section of this episode, which also means that you're going to hear more of my personal opinions. And it's more of an informal recording because those episodes are ones that, first of all, they're video, so you can see my face as they're doing this, but I really just take the Daily Digest and make some notes in it, the Daily Digest being the first part of the Congressional Record. It lets you know what happens every day in Congress. And so I'm looking through that every single week and letting you know what Congress did in the previous week by using that part of the Congressional Record. And so it's very off the cuff. I will tell you what's going on in my personal life sometimes. I will definitely tell you my opinions more so than I do on these public episodes. And I have found that the people who are paying for the show are really enjoying those episodes. And so I don't want to stop them. And so this episode is me taking all of that work I did and at least producing something from the public from it, because I think all of us in the green room is what I call our little Congressional Dish team community back there. The people who are in my green room, I feel like all of us are feeling like we are more informed because of these Last Week in Congress episodes. Congressional Dish does a really good job of doing deep dives, but we've always struggled to stay current. And I feel like we're starting to find that balance with these Last Week in Congress episodes. And so I'm kind of giving you a taste of those today. But I do have to tell you, there is a bunch of things that I just cannot get to in this summary episode that we are witnessing by checking this stuff out weekly on Last Week in Congress. So like, this is stupid, but it's a pattern that we keep noticing. But like Congress keeps declaring awareness days, but doing it late. So for example, on May 19th, Congress declared that May 2nd would be or was United States Foreign Service Day. But they declared that day 17 days late. And so how is it useful to have an awareness day that is in the past? And they keep on doing this. It is baffling to us. I also will let you know about hearings that you may want to watch, even if I don't have the time to watch them. And although I've got to tell you, like, one of the things that we've all been really frustrated by in this Congress is that the Republicans have been failing completely to conduct any oversight of the Trump administration, despite, I mean, if you don't think that this administration is breaking laws, I don't know what to do with you at this point. They just are. We have people being snatched up off the street by masked people that don't have warrants and being put in unmarked vans to locations where they are taken, and then they're not allowed to call lawyers or their families. Like, this is the most un-American stuff I've ever heard of. And this Congress has not investigated that at all. In fact, they keep investigating the Biden administration despite it being out of power. But just looking at what they are doing and seeing that they are investigating Joe Biden instead of Donald Trump, I think this is something worth knowing. Also worth knowing is that Donald Trump keeps extending national emergencies. Now, I have to be fair to President Trump. This is not a weird Trump thing. He is just doing what presidents have been doing for my entire life. But we are under so many national emergencies, some of which have been in effect for decades. In fact, this year alone, I know that I have told you about an extension of a national emergency at least 16 times so far. And many of these so-called emergencies have been going on in faraway lands for decades. And so the way I see these is it's a total abuse of emergency powers happening over and over again by every administration dating back to before I was even born. And it continues to this day. And I do think it's worth knowing where we are still operating with emergency powers after all this time. But yeah, I think these episodes are really valuable, and there's just more in there than I can give you in this summary episode. And so if you want to hear that, please support the show on Patreon. The way it works payment-wise is that you only pay for the public episodes, and I almost never am able to do more than 2 per month. We have tiers on there, but you actually get to decide how much each episode is worth to you. You get to pick that number. You get charged for 2 episodes a month at most. And the Last Week in Congress episodes, those are all bonuses as a thank you for supporting the show. And it really does make you a part of Team Congressional Dish, and you get more behind the scenes information than everybody else does, both about Congress and about me and my production team. So I highly recommend doing that. And then if you just want to support the show, if the public episodes are enough Congress for you in this Congress, I get it. But I do refuse all advertising money. I refuse all campaign money. I don't have guests on this show. So all of these, there's a bunch of different ways that podcasters get paid. I say no to all of it. The only money that I take is direct from listeners that support this show on the value for value model. So thank you to everyone who has been sending in money for July, because I worked so hard reading the big, beautiful bill, but couldn't get the Patreon money for a second episode since I spent 3 weeks reading that disaster of a law. But some of you have been helping to make up that hole. And I really appreciate the PayPals and the Venmos and the Zells and the Chipotle gift cards. You know, I love those. I appreciate the paper checks that have been sent in, the Cash Apps, everything. And yeah, just thank you for doing that. And you can always find all those payment methods on not only the support the show page on congressionaldish.com, but also in every episode show notes, because trust is earned. And so in every episode show notes, I give you our sources so that you can easily check our work. So yeah, please support the show, and thank you if you already are. All right, so let's get started with what the 119th Congress has done so far, beginning with the laws. So there have been 34 new laws that have been signed since the beginning of the 119th Congress in January. And the first law was the Laken Riley Act. That became law on January 29th. And it was the top priority of the second round of the Trump years. And we actually did an entire episode on this already. But the part of that law that really sticks out to me is the fact that the Laken Riley Act enables indefinite imprisonment of possibly innocent legal immigrants, followed maybe by deportation. And I don't know if Laken Riley is how this is being justified, because at this point, I don't know how a lot of what the Trump administration is doing is being justified legally. But I can tell you at this point, it is a fact that legal immigrants are being imprisoned and threatened with deportation. So just this month, for example, a mother from Massachusetts who has lived in the United States since she was 9 years old and who is a legal permanent resident, so she is here legally, was recently imprisoned for at least 10 days without access to a lawyer or being able to contact her family because of a misdemeanor marijuana possession charge on her record from 20 years ago. And so this is happening. And the Laken Riley Act is just one way that the Republican Congress is attempting to make injustices like this legal and to help the Trump administration threaten immigrants, whether they are here illegally or legally. And they are enriching private prison corporations in the process. And so if you want more details on the Laken Riley Act, I highly recommend that you listen to episode 311 for all of those details. Also, you should know about the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is now the Big Beautiful Law. And the last 2 episodes of Congressional Dish have been about that law. And the thing in my mind that I can't turn off when I think about this new law is that it too further legalizes indefinite detention, but this time of anyone. Specifically, the Big Beautiful Law says that a human being can be imprisoned by the federal government while the government figures out our legal status. There's no time limit put on how long they can take. And then they can take as long as they want to deport someone as well, keeping that person and their children in prison during that process. And then, of course, there's so much more in that horrible law. It uses dirty tricks to deny millions of us health insurance, to deny us food benefits, and it's an absolute environmental disaster. And so I hate that law. I am not shy about telling people that. It was 840 pages of just one horrible thing after another, and I did explain it to you in detail. The whole thing is about 3 hours split up in between 2 episodes, episode 320 and 321. Please take the time to listen to that because that is going to be a society-changing law. And once we eventually, hopefully, kick these Republicans out of power, there are things that need to be repealed. And so we should know about those details so we can ask for those specifics. Another thing that this Congress has accomplished is they took back about $9 billion that had been appropriated by Congress in the Rescissions Act. Now, this was Congress basically doing what the fake Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, was supposed to do, except they did it legally and at a hilariously lower amount than promised by Elon Musk when he was still a part of Trump world. You know, before he outed Donald Trump as being a main character in the Epstein files and was banished back to the private sector. But instead of finding and eliminating $2 trillion worth of waste, fraud, and abuse from our government as promised, the Republicans in Congress eliminated $9 billion from the budget, which is 0.45% of what they promised to eliminate from the budget. Now, most of those cuts came from the State Department, but I can tell you that there are so many transfer authorities built into both the state and defense budgets and their authorizations. So I'm really not worried about the State Department being able to figure out how to move money around to do pretty much whatever they want to do. The real consequence of the Rescissions Act is that it took $1 billion away from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which politically was targeted by the Republican Party because of the party's disdain for PBS and NPR, which are networks that refuse to report right-wing bullshit as fact. But this move also defunds rural radio and television stations all over this country. And I think that is the real danger in this law. Because rural radio and television stations keep communities informed and connected in parts of the United States where, despite the billions of dollars of tax money we have set aside for the effort, broadband internet is still often hard to find. And it's because of this that there was not unanimous Republican support for this law. In the Senate, it passed 51-48 with all Democrats and independents, and Republican Senators Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Susan Collins of Maine voting no. And the reason for their no vote was crystal clear, because they together tried to get the bill amended to stop the defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And so when they couldn't change the bill, they voted no on it. Over in the House, it passed 214-208 with every Democrat voting no, along with 4 Republicans. Another bill that became law in the 119th Congress is the Take It Down Act. This new law requires social media platforms to remove non-consensual, intimate visual depictions. So basically, it forces social media companies to remove nudie pics from the internet. Now, this passed unanimously in the Senate, but a few Republicans in the House didn't like this idea. They were Thomas Massie of Kentucky and Tom Burleson of Missouri. Both of those Republicans in the House voted no. Now, Tom Massey said that he voted no because he was worried that there was no appeal process required and that there were no penalties for submitting false takedown requests. And Tim Burleson's office said that he voted no because he thought that the state laws were enough. We also have a new law called the Genius Act, which Trump said was named after him, because of course he said that. But it wasn't. The Genius Act is actually about cryptocurrencies. So what it does is it changes the law so that only subsidiaries of regulated banks and financial institutions are allowed to issue stablecoins, and it requires the financial industry to hold enough actual cash to cover the stablecoins that they issue. Now, if you don't know what any of that means, stablecoins are cryptocurrencies that are tied to the US dollar. And so why would anyone want to use a cryptocurrency tied to the dollar instead of an actual dollar? I don't actually know. But the net effect of this is that it legalizes at least this kind of cryptocurrency and will likely make stablecoins, and therefore cryptocurrencies, more integrated into our banking system. Now, this is something that the cryptocurrency was actually asking for. They wanted to be regulated in this way, and they got it. And so that's the big deal about this law. But there is a Donald Trump specific issue with this law that is worth knowing. And that is the fact that this new law prohibits members of Congress and senior executive branch officials from issuing stablecoins while in office. But this does not apply to the president and vice president, which is a problem because President Trump is already essentially scamming people via the crypto industry with his Trump coin and the Melania coin. And so Donald Trump is already in this game and would be permitted to be in the stablecoin business, even though other elected officials are not. And so the fact that he would be exempt from this, I think that's a problem. And I know other people will agree with me about that. But not all of those people are congressional Democrats, because 16 Democrats in the Senate and 102 Democrats in the House actually voted yes on this, along with the Republicans. As far as the Republicans are concerned, Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, he was the only Republican that voted no in the Senate, and there were 12 Republicans in the House that voted yes. And so the Republican Party is almost fully behind this idea, while the Democrats, especially in the House, they were split. We also have a new law called the Halt Fentanyl Act, and this new law made fentanyl a Schedule I drug, which means that it is officially classified as a drug with no currently accepted medical value, which is bullshit because it is a well-known and often used painkiller in medical settings. But I did look into this one because there is a separate kind of fentanyl that is still listed as a Schedule II drug, and even though this has been signed into law, is still being used by doctors. And so it appears that the real consequence of this new law is harsher penalties for street fentanyl offenses. Now, when this was voted on in Congress, that wasn't clear. And so I do know that some people voted against this because they didn't know if fentanyl would still be allowed to be used in medical settings, which I think does kind of explain how it is that the Democrats were almost evenly split on voting for this. So there were 104 Democrats who voted yes in the House and 103 who voted no. Wasn't the same over on the Republican side. The Republican side was almost unanimous. Almost all of them voted yes. There was only one Republican who said no, and that was once again Thomas Massey of Kentucky. Over in the Senate, it passed 84-16. All of the no's were Democrats and independents. But again, like I said, the opposition was because of concerns about whether or not any fentanyl would remain Schedule II and be available not only for medical use, but also research. But then there were also concerns, especially by the Democrats, about the harsh mandatory minimum prison sentences that drug addicts would be subject to after this became law, with no corresponding investment in addiction treatment. And so that's now law, and we'll just have to see if fentanyl remains available as a Schedule II as we move forward. There were a couple laws that were signed that I've got to tell you, I actually like. So one of them was the Filing Relief for Natural Disasters Act. This is a law that now extends the tax filing deadline for people who are affected by state-declared disasters if the extension is requested by the state's governor. Before this law, that deadline was only extended for federally declared disasters. And this passed unanimously in the House and the Senate. Absolutely no one voted no. And another law that I really like is the VA Home Loan Act. And this is one that would authorize the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to be able to essentially buy a veteran's mortgage debt if that veteran was about to be foreclosed on. So basically, the government could step in and then the government would own the loan, which allows the government to change the terms of the loan to keep the veteran in their home. In both the House and the Senate, this passed without an actual vote, which means this was also completely uncontroversial. And then finally, another law that I like is the Aerial Firefighting Enhancement Act. This new law gives the Department of Defense permission to sell airplane and airplane parts to both domestic and foreign governments so that they can be used for wildfire suppression. And I really like this because I am a longtime off and on resident of Southern California. My family moved to Southern California while I was 6 years old. My family is still in Southern California. And when people ask me where I'm from, even though that is a complicated question for a digital nomad, California is my number one home. And in January of this year, one of the most horrific fires that I actually didn't think it could get as bad as it did. We had two fires that wiped out entire cities here in Southern California. We lost the Pacific Palisades and Altadena, which was insane. And so I was living in Texas at the time. I was watching it on TV. And one of the firefighting tools that we are for sure the most thankful for are the Super Scooper airplanes. And you can see them duck down into lakes or into the ocean, wherever they can find the closest body of water. And they fill the plane with water and they use those planes to dump the water onto the fires in our canyons where, if you're not from here, I don't think you understand that, yes, Southern California, Los Angeles is on the ocean, but we also have legit mountains. And so like the Pacific Palisades fire, those are not able to be fought by hand. You can't get fire trucks into these canyons. These are very large canyons. You can only do it by plane. And so a lot of our planes that we have here in California are former military planes. And so that's how I know that this new law can make a real difference by giving this permission for the next 10 years for the DoD to give the states these planes if the DoD chooses to do so. Now, like I said just now, the permission only lasts for 10 years. It will go away if it's not extended in 2035, but we can worry about that a decade from now. And this was another one that was completely uncontroversial. It didn't even need a vote in both the House and the Senate. So those are the most impactful new laws that were kind of standalone, their own type thing laws. But in the beginning of the 119th Congress, there was a lot of laws that were passed because of the Congressional Review Act, which were essentially regulation killers. So out of the 34 new laws, 16 of them, almost half of the new laws, were regulation killers. And so what I mean by that is that the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to overturn regulations from the last administration within 60 days of them becoming final. And so this is not something that we're going to see anymore going forward in this Congress, but we should check out what regulations they killed from the Biden administration while they could and who benefited from the killing of those regulations. So one of the regulation killers was HJ Res 25. And by killing this regulation, they allowed the brokers who deal with digital, including crypto assets, to get out of having to report their gross proceeds to the IRS like they have to do with regular money. So essentially, by killing this regulation, Congress helped members of the investor class hide their earnings. And the Congressional Budget Office said that this is going to cost us $500 million a year in lost revenue from tax cheaters. And we know that these are going to be wealthy tax cheaters because this really only applies to people who are wealthy enough to have brokers. Like, I don't have a broker, and you probably don't either. But every Republican in the House voted for this, which is not surprising because the Republican Party has long acted as the servants of the rich. But proving once again that too many Democrats serve the investor class as well, 76 House Democrats joined all of the Republicans in passing this favor for rich investor class tax cheaters. And the same thing happened in the Senate as well. All Republican senators voted yes, because of course they did, along with 17 Democratic senators. Congress also passed SJ Res 28, and this is a regulation killer that has to do with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is the only agency in the United States government that exists to police consumer products and to police the banks. And so what Congress did is they killed a regulation by the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection that would have policed digital payment applications just like any bank is policed. And so what this did in reality is that this essentially exempts Apple Pay and Google Pay and Cash App and PayPal and Venmo, all those type of apps from Consumer Financial Protection Bureau policing, allowing them to escape accountability. You know, that certainly doesn't protect me, the user, but it does protect them, which I think shows us pretty clearly who our members of Congress are currently serving. And specifically, when I say members of Congress, I'm talking about Republicans because they're the ones that did this. Every Republican in Congress, except for Josh Hawley of Missouri, voted for invincibility for these big banking/tech industry apps. Every Democrat and independent voted no. Congress also passed SJ Res 13, and this is a regulation killer about Bank Merger Act applications. So the backstory on this is that during the Biden administration, there was a rule that was put out in 2024 that would have required more scrutiny of bank mergers, with mergers of banks that have over $50 billion in assets targeted in particular. So we're talking about big banks. And the goal of this rule is to make sure that we weren't allowing the creation of more too big to fail banks, which pose a risk to the entire financial system, as we learned in 2008, and to make sure that we're not creating monopoly situations in banking. Now, the big banks, of course, called this, too burdensome. Like, how could we possibly deal with all the paperwork and stay in business with only tens of billions of dollars in assets? And so they spent more than $63 million lobbying Congress, which is enough money to pay 480 lobbyists to roam around and schmooze our members of Congress on their behalf. And by the way, 296 of the banking industry lobbyists are people who used to work in Congress. So they were either staffers or members of Congress themselves before selling their souls to go and work for the bankers. And so, yeah, they had so many lobbyists running around saying, you have to change this rule. And so Republicans, and Republicans alone, they passed this on a party line vote. But the Republicans decided to kill that regulation and pave the way for more big bank mergers, fewer banking choices for us, and more risk to the financial system that's caused by having so few companies that have so much power over our financial system. The Republicans also killed a Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection regulation, this one, though, affecting we, the peasants, directly. So during the Biden administration, the CFPB created a regulation that limited bank overdraft fees to $5. And so the minute the Republicans took over, they killed that regulation. And so now banks can charge high overdraft fees once again. All but 2 Republicans in Congress voted yes on allowing banks to charge us high overdraft fees. The only 2 who were against it were Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri and Representative Ryan McKenzie of Pennsylvania in the House. But every single Democrat in Congress voted to keep overdraft fees capped at $5, but they lost that fight. And then they killed a bunch of regulations that had to do with helping keep our environment clean. And so in their attack on our environment, they passed SJ Res 60, and this was one that killed a regulation submitted by the National Park Service that would have prevented ATVs, so off-road vehicles that damage the environment, from driving around on approximately 26 miles of park roads in the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. Now, Glen Canyon is huge, and this area is mainly in Arizona, but it also pops into Utah. And it encompasses popular outdoor areas such as Bears Ears and Lake Powell. This is a really big area. And in that area, there are 388 total miles of roads where ATVs could always go wherever they want. And so the regulation would have only closed off 24 miles of roads because people were taking their ATVs off the roads and damaging the pristine environment in especially sensitive areas. But the Republicans are apparently all for them doing that because every Republican in Congress and 2 Democrats in the House sided with the greedy people that are being reckless little assholes with their ATVs and harming the most sensitive areas. And now that regulation is dead. Another regulation was killed by HJ Res 42. This one killed a regulation that would have required energy efficiency labeling for washing machines, dishwashers, and industrial air conditioners. Now, this is one that would have basically streamlined reporting that goes to the Department of Energy. And so it didn't necessarily kill the standards themselves, but it did make the Department of Energy's job harder. Every Republican in Congress voted yes, along with 7 Democrats in the House. But then they went for the actual standards themselves with HJ Res 75, because this one killed the regulation that was essentially the energy conservation program for commercial refrigerators, freezers, and refrigerator freezers, because apparently we just want to make our appliances as inefficient as possible. And so you have to sit back and wonder, why would anyone do this? And I think it's because it makes the utility companies and the energy companies more money if these appliances are burning more energy. So it's like you can see why they would do this, even though it seems like conserving energy is a good thing for humans and the planet and for our pocketbooks, because we would get to pay less in money if the appliances that we were sold were more energy efficient. But we are not the ones who these Republicans are working for. And I'm saying that because we are reading their laws and we can see what they do. And just to make that clear, every single Republican in Congress voted yes on this, along with 5 Democrats in the House. They also passed H.J. Res 24 into law, which killed a Department of Energy regulation that set energy conservation standards for walk-in coolers and freezers. So in the Senate, it was a party line vote. All Republicans, yes. All Democrats and independents, no. And in the House, it was all Republicans, yes, along with 6 Democrats. The Republicans also passed H.J. Res 20, which killed a regulation that would have required gas water heaters to be more efficient by 2029. Now, had this regulation gone into effect and you bought a water heater, you would have spent less money on gas. And guess who does not like that? The fossil fuel industry. They want us to buy more gas. They want us spending more of our money on gas. And so what do the Republicans do? They got rid of the regulation so that we will spend more money on gas. And it is fair to blame this on Republicans because every single one of them in Congress voted yes. But there was a little Democratic support for this as well. In the Senate, both of Georgia's senators, so John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, both of those Democrats voted yes on keeping gas water heaters inefficient. And in the House, 11 Democrats voted for this as well. The Republicans also made sure that S.J. Res 11 was passed, and this is one that killed a regulation by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So this regulation that Congress killed would have required oil and gas explorers in the ocean to submit a report on if there are archaeological artifacts under the water where they're trying to explore and drill. And so we're talking stuff like shipwrecks or the lost city of Atlantis. Like, I don't know what's down there, but that's the point. No one knows what's down there. We wanted them to make sure that they knew what was down there and tell the government before they go and destroy whatever is down there. But of course, the fossil fuel companies complained to their bought-off congressmen and said, this is too burdensome to check and do a report. And so the Republicans got him out of having to do the report. And the only Republican to vote against this in all of Congress was in the House. His name is Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. But every Republican other than him voted yes. And as for the Democrats, 9 Democrats in the House said yes, along with Democratic Senator John Hickenlooper of Colorado. All the rest of them were no's. This Congress also passed H.J. Res 35, which killed a regulation that made clear compliance requirements under the Methane Emissions Reduction Program. Under this program, the EPA would have collected fines from the oil and gas industry if their emissions exceeded the amounts allowed. Once again, the only Republican who voted no in all of Congress was Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. Every other Republican in the House and the Senate voted yes. And almost every Democrat voted no, except for 6 Democrats in the House. They also passed H.J. Res 61, and the name of the regulation they killed speaks for itself. They killed the national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants from rubber tire manufacturing. It's pretty straightforward. This one passed 55 to 45 in the Senate, with every single Republican voting for polluting our communities. Surprise, surprise. But they were also joined by 2 Democratic senators. And these senators were from the same state. So both of Virginia's Democratic senators, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, voted yes on allowing more pollution from rubber tire manufacturers. Over in the House, only 1 Republican voted no. Once again, it's Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. And there were 7 Democrats who voted yes. And then finally, there was an abuse of the Congressional Review Act that was done by the Republicans that I think we need to be aware of. Because the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to overturn regulations, to overturn rules within 60 days of them becoming final. But the Republicans decided to use the Congressional Review Act to get rid of a waiver, or a few waivers, that were given to California. Now, the thing about the waivers is that these were Environmental Protection Agency waivers, which allow states, when granted, to enact environmental standards that are more strict than federal standards when it comes to like pollution controls. And specifically, what California is trying to do and what the Republicans in Congress are trying to stop is that, one, California wants to require that the only new cars that would be allowed to be sold in California starting in 2035 be zero-emission vehicles. California also wants to enact stricter car emission standards than the federal standard. And California also wants to regulate the nitrous and nitrogen oxide pollution that's emitted from heavy trucks. So what the Republicans did is they passed 3 different resolutions basically saying, we know the EPA gave you this waiver, but we are taking it away. But the Senate parliamentarian had ruled that the Congressional Review Act does not apply to waivers. And for the first time that I know of, the Senate just ignored the Senate parliamentarian and they passed these resolutions anyway, and Trump signed them into law. And so what happens now is that California and 10 other states are suing the Trump administration because this very well might not be legal. And so as of right now, these regulation killers or waiver killers are law, but we need to see what's going to happen in the courts. So that's it for the new laws so far in the 119th Congress. When we look at the Senate in particular, they have been spending most of their time in the first 8 months serving as a Trump administration confirmation machine. And you can't really blame them for that because we are requiring the Senate to confirm way too many officials because they're still nowhere near done. There are still literally thousands of nominations that need to be confirmed, which in saner times, it seems like something we should reform because it's really stopped our Senate from doing anything else. But it is what it is. And I think we all know quite a bit about the cabinet level secretaries who are confirmed right away and who are in the news all the time. So we know plenty about like Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. But there are lower level confirmations that we've been tracking on Last Week in Congress for the last 8 months. And so right now, I'm going to share with you information about the most interesting ones. Now, these clips that I'm going to share with you now were grabbed directly from our Last Week in Congress episodes. And so please excuse any weird transitions. And like I said before, the Last Week in Congress episodes are off the cuff. And so if you don't like my opinions being present in my podcast, well, it's time for earmuffs. But here are some confirmations worth knowing about. And these are being presented in the order that these people were confirmed. And by the way, there were a lot more confirmations in this. And so if you want to hear about all of them, again, there are more than 20 Last Week in Congress episodes waiting for you if you support the show on Patreon. And we are going to keep looking into the backgrounds of the newly confirmed Trump appointees when the Senate gets back to work starting in September. Because like I said, the list of people that still need to be confirmed is long. But for now, here is information about Trump appointees who have now been officially empowered. Now we have Kelly Loeffler, who is the administrator of the Small Business Administration. And you might remember Kelly Loeffler because she was a senator for a hot minute in 2020. She was appointed to the position and then she did try to run for a 6-year term and she didn't win. And that was really key because that helped the Democrats keep control of the Senate in that election. So there was a lot of news about her. And the reason that she didn't win is because she was filthy rich. And she's someone who had traded on her insider knowledge of COVID. So as a senator, she was kind of told like, hey, we've got this big disaster coming. And then they sold a bunch of stocks. And her net worth is about $100 million. So she's quite poor compared to some of the other people in this administration. But her husband is the CEO of the company that owns the New York Stock Exchange. And so seeing her as the administrator of the Small Business Administration, being with the CEO of the guy that owns the stock exchange doesn't exactly scream, I'm here for small business. So I have major concerns about her being a big business mole in the Small Business Administration. The Senate confirmed Lori Chavez DeRemer. I'm not really sure if that's how I pronounce her last name. She is now going to be our Secretary of Labor. And this is one of the more interesting confirmations that we've seen so far because they actually know her sort of in Congress because she was in Congress in the 118th. She was in the House of Representatives representing Oregon's 5th District. Before that, she was the mayor of a place called Happy Valley, Oregon. Sounds like a lovely place, but I have no idea if it actually is that happy. But when it comes to her being the Secretary of Labor, her father was in the Teamsters Union. So she was raised with that pro-union vibe. And her nomination was supported by the Teamsters. And when she was in Congress in the 118th, she supported a bill that didn't go anywhere. There was a lot of buzz around it. It was called the PRO Act, and it was a pro-union bill. Most Republicans were against it. She was for it. And so she's not the worst person. I mean, when we're gauging things on the level of the Trump administration, not the worst is pretty good. And so when I look at the vote, this was an interesting vote because she was confirmed by, even if you could filibuster this, it was a filibuster proof majority. She passed 67-32. Out of the people that voted against her, most were Democrats, but there were 3 Republicans that joined the Democrats in saying no, including Mitch McConnell. So I found that kind of interesting. And there were 17 Democrats who I think noticed that she's not the worst and did vote to confirm her. So we now have a Secretary of Labor. This was the nomination of Stephen Bradbury to be the Deputy Secretary of Transportation. And that name jumped out at me, and I'm glad that I checked because this was a really controversial nomination. All Democrats voted against it, along with all independents and Rand Paul, who is a Republican. So there was a lot of opposition to this one. His nomination only passed by 1 vote. It was 51 that passed him. And I know why I recognize his name. Back in the George W. Bush years, in the second half, when we knew about all the illegal things that George W. Bush had done, like torture people, in the second half, when they were trying to justify all that, this guy, Stephen Bradbury, was in the Office of Legal Counsel. He's a lawyer, and he was the author of the torture, or some of the torture justification memos. So he's a monster. And then in the first Trump administration, that's when he first got into the transportation department. I don't know why. If you look at his background, he's a lawyer, but he was in the Department of Transportation. And for 8 days, he was our acting Secretary of Transportation after Elaine Chao. She was the Secretary of Transportation. She's also Mitch McConnell's wife. She was, like many of us, disgusted with Trump's behavior leading up to and on January 6, 2021. And so she resigned. And so for 8 days after she resigned, this guy, Stephen Bradbury, was our acting Secretary of Transportation. And so now he's going to be the number 2 to Sean Duffy. So yeah, torture memo guy is back in our government. Our former senator, this was a senator from Georgia, David Perdue, is nominated to be the ambassador to China. And considering, China has been branded, whatever you think about this, whether it's true or not, as our greatest adversary, if not enemy, that ambassadorship really matters. And we also have a president who is slapping tariffs on China and lots of other countries, including our allies, trying to bring jobs back into the United States. That is President Trump's goal. Now, he might be doing it like an idiot, but that is the idea behind the tariffs, which makes David Perdue, as our ambassador to China, a really interesting, weird selection, because before David Perdue was a senator, his business experience, so like in the 1990s, he worked for Sara Lee. He was the vice president of their Asia operations. And as that vice president, he oversaw that company's decision to source their goods from China and other countries. They closed dozens of U.S. plants, including plants in his own home state of Georgia. And so he was literally his whole job was outsourcing. He also did similar outsourcing things as the CEO of Reebok. He was also the CEO of Dollar General for a while, and all of their products are crap from China. And so really, his entire private sector career was based around outsourcing jobs overseas, something that he has straight up admitted to. And yet he's going to be the ambassador to China. So just a really interesting pick in that regard. But I think the reason that he's the pick has a lot less to do with ideological consistency, obviously, and more to do with the fact that this is one of the guys who said that the 2020 election was stolen for Donald Trump and stuck to that bullshit. So I think that's a loyalty pick. We also are getting Usha Maria Turner. So she's going to, if confirmed, be the assistant administrator for the EPA. This set off a red flag for me because her jobs in the private sector have all been in the service of continuing our addiction to fossil fuels, specifically natural gas. So before coming into, or recently in the 2020s, she worked for Chesapeake Energy, which has apparently been renamed Expand Energy, but they specialize in fossil fuels, oil and gas. For 10 years before that, she worked at OGE, which is a power company that uses 67% gas, 22% coal, and only 7% renewables. And then for more than a decade before that, she worked at Luminant, which is the largest supplier of natural gas here in the state of Texas. And so for her to be in the EPA, I just don't like it. I think that you have some loyalty to those that paid you for over 25 years of your life. And that's the fossil fuel industry. James Dan Bishop, you might remember him because he was in the House of Representatives from 2019 to 2025. He's been on the show a few times because I think he's kind of a dipshit. But he is now our Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. This is worth knowing because he is going to be basically the understudy to Russell Vought, the guy who wrote a piece of Project 2025. This is a guy who's all for slashing our government, and the Office of Management and Budget is kind of like the parent agency of whatever the hell DOGE is. He is now in that chain of command, and this is a guy who is in the House Freedom Caucus. He's not one of the congressmen that I think is one of the smartest ones, but I do think that he is someone who is loyal to Donald Trump. And so he's now number 2 to Russell Vought. Aaron Reitz, who is now our Assistant Attorney General. This guy was confirmed 52 to 46. This guy was recently Ted Cruz's chief of staff, but the more concerning part of his resume is the 3 years that he spent here in Texas under our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who most of my friends consider to be a bit of a monster. And while working for Ken Paxton, our new Assistant Attorney General sued woke corporations, those are his words, not mine, which essentially means, like, for example, banks that didn't invest in fossil fuels. Banks that made their own decisions to not invest in fossil fuels were hunted down by Ken Paxton and our new Assistant Attorney General, Aaron Reitz. He also fought the left's attempts to corrupt Texas elections. I don't know what the fuck that means. And then he also helped with the crafting Texas's scary anti-abortion laws. Because people have died here in Texas because basically, unless you yourself are dying, they won't take the baby out of you, even if, you know, you can get sepsis and get killed. And so people have died because of this man here in Texas. And now he's our Deputy Attorney General. And that just, if you don't like Texas politics, you're not going to like the fact that it's infecting us on the national level in our Department of Justice. The only real work that the Senate accomplished on Tuesday the 1st was approving of the nomination of Matthew Whitaker to be our representative to NATO, which is our military compact over in Europe. And this guy has more of a background in law. So he's a really interesting pick because he has no foreign policy experience. I know his name because he was the acting U.S. Attorney General in Trump's first administration from like late 2018 to early 2019. This was after Jeff Sessions kind of like, he resigned, but he resigned under duress because he had recused himself from the Russia investigation, and Trump was like super pissed. And so he eventually resigned. And so Matthew Whitaker was the one who held the position without being confirmed by the Senate in between Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr being our Attorney General. And prior to that, Matthew Whitaker was a U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa, and he was a George W. Bush appointee. But I think the reason that he got the pick is that during the Biden administration, Matthew Whitaker went on Fox News a lot, and he was basically saying that Trump was being politically prosecuted for all kinds of things, including faking 7 election certifications and trying to steal the 2020 election. So I think his defense of Trump is what got him to be the NATO ambassador. So just another example of someone who's doing something in the Trump administration they're not really qualified for. But that's official now because every Republican decided that would be a good idea, even though every Democrat said no, but they're outnumbered. This was a controversial nomination. All Republicans, yes. All Democrats and independents, no. But we now have Dean Sauer, who is going to be our Solicitor General of the United States. And this is a position a lot of people don't pay attention to. Maybe because it's called the Solicitor General. It sounds like, someone that solicits sex on the Las Vegas Strip. Like the word solicit, I don't know. It just sounds so dirty, but it's actually a really important position. This is the person that represents our government in court cases, especially in the Supreme Court. And this guy in particular, he had represented Trump in his case for presidential immunity. And so now the guy who was arguing that Trump should have immunity is going to be arguing on behalf of the government. We now have Elbridge Colby as our Undersecretary for Defense for Policy. Now, Mr. Elbridge Colby, this elitist snob is a guy who's actually been featured on Congressional Dish, which is why I have an opinion about him. He was someone that was on episode 225. He wasn't like a guest. He was in a hearing. But that episode is called Targets of the Free Marketeers. This is when we were looking at the end of the Trump administration, kind of what they were looking on a world, global order scale in matters of war. And so this guy was asked to testify. At the time, he was at a think tank. But one of the reasons that I don't like him is because of his work with the George W. Bush administration. He was on the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission. And you might remember when it comes to Iraq, there were no weapons of mass destruction. And so this guy is obviously failing upward from there. He also helped to create the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for the George W. Bush administration. Then he left government after W was no longer president. He spent 7 years at a think tank called the Center for a New American Security. These are a bunch of regime changers. And then in the Trump administration, Elbridge Colby was in the Trump administration in the Defense Department, and he was one of the main authors of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. I also did an episode about that back in 2018. Short story, he's a warmonger. I also looked through his clips, the ones that I had of him from when he testified in 2020. And essentially, like what stood out with this guy to me is that when he talked about our allies, he basically said that we need to be allying with countries that fear the same things we do, and they don't necessarily have to be democracies. Like, it doesn't really matter. And then he also said, we don't really need any more allies. And at this point, when the entire world is pissed off at us, I'd like to have as many allies as we can get. So this is the guy who's doing policy at the Defense Department, and he's not exactly pro-ally from what I heard. And then he's also one of these anti-China hawks, which in a Trump administration shouldn't be all that surprising. But back when I first saw this guy testifying, I described him as a young Mr. Peanut. And so Mr. Peanut is now going to be very, very influential once again in the Trump administration on matters of war. Now, there were 3 Democrats that were fine with Mr. Peanut having this position. So Elise Slotkin of Michigan, Mark Kelly of Arizona, and Jack Reed of Rhode Island voted for Mr. Peanut. But a very interesting Republican joined the rest of the Democrats in saying no, and that was Mitch McConnell. And he tends to be one of the warmonger types. And so it really makes me wonder why he would vote against Mr. Peanut. And I don't actually have that answer. In another party line vote, we now have Paul Atkins, who is going to be a member, and I believe he is now the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. This guy is a huge red flag to me. Huge, huge, huge red flag, because he was the SEC commissioner from 2002 to 2008. So this is during the George W. Bush administration, where his priorities were reducing regulatory burdens on companies and banks, which means fewer rules. And he also promoted financial innovation, which means in letting them invent new ways to gamble, which, oh my God, did they ever. Things like credit default swaps and like that, which tanked the entire world's economy in 2008, which is when he was shown the door. So he has a terrible track record of policing the banks. And so Trump, of course, is putting him in charge of policing Wall Street and the banks. Just terrible decisions all around. This one is actually quite upsetting to me. So by a vote of 53 to 46, this was a controversial nomination. Former Governor Mike Huckabee is now our ambassador to the state of Israel. Mike Huckabee is a Baptist preacher, which, like, fine, believe whatever fairy tales you want to believe. But he is going to be representing us with a foreign country with God as one of his reasons for governing. And what I mean by that is that this is a guy, when it comes to Israel, he does not believe that Palestine is a thing. So he very openly believes in a one-state solution, which basically means that Israel gets all of the land, no more West Bank, no more Gaza. It all belongs to Israelis. And the reason? Well, he said that the Israelis should have the West Bank in particular because, quote, the title deed was given by God to Abraham and his heirs, unquote. He's also said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. So this is just not someone that I trust in any way on this issue. He is governing by God. I really, really hate that nomination for that position, especially while Israel is being so incredibly violent with the people of Gaza. And I saw a video yesterday over in the West Bank. There are now tanks rolling through the streets of the West Bank because we're all rightfully focused on Gaza because they bombed. Remember that hospital that was bombed about 10 days after the war started? I hate calling it a war because it's basically just a one-sided slaughter at this point. But when they started bombing Gaza, there was a bomb that fell right in front of a hospital. And the whole world was pissed off about it. And the Israelis said, like, no, that was actually a Palestinian bomb, and just like denied that they would ever bomb a hospital. Well, they've bombed every hospital. And that original one that the whole world was pissed about was the only functional hospital that was left in the northern part of Gaza. They destroyed that. So that hospital is now gone. So it's incredibly violent in Gaza. I've never been more ashamed to be an American and a part of anything in my entire life. And in the shadow of that, the Israelis are now taking more and more land in the West Bank. And so this whole idea of a one-state solution, that does seem to be what the Trump administration is going to make happen. They do seem like they are going to kick out all of the Palestinians. Now, where are they going to go? I don't know. Are they aware that this is going to make Arabs hate us forever as if we're loved to begin with? I mean, this is what 9/11 was all about. The blowback from this, if we actually allow this to happen, is going to be horrendous. And Mike Huckabee has just straight up forever said that I am a unrepentant Zionist and the Jews should have all of that land. It's really, really gross what we are participating in. And Mike Huckabee is just about the last person that I want in charge of any of it. So yeah, total red flag with that one. And by the way, there was one Democrat who voted for him, and it's John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. And Fetterman, when it comes to Israel, I hate his position on Israel. Like, he has been in support of Israel's violence against the Palestinians 100% the whole way. And so for him to vote for Mike Huckabee, like, John Fetterman, I'm really struggling to control my anger with this. They also confirmed Charles Kushner to be our ambassador to not one, but two locations. He is now going to be our ambassador to France and Monaco. And if the name Kushner sounds familiar, it is because this is the father-in-law to Trump's daughter. So Trump's daughter married Jared Kushner. Jared's father is Charles Kushner. And Charles Kushner is a fucking criminal. In 2005, he pled guilty to 18 federal charges, including tax evasion, making illegal campaign contributions, and witness tampering. And the witness tampering part of that is the part that I remembered, because he tried to blackmail his own sister. And the way that he did it is he hired a prostitute to seduce his sister's husband He then videotaped the two of them together and sent it to his sister in an attempt to intimidate them into silence about his crimes. He got in trouble for all of that. He was sentenced to a couple years in prison, but then he was pardoned by Donald Trump in 2020, and now he's our ambassador to France. When it comes to who approved of this, of course, the majority of the Republican Party. The only person who's in the Republican Party in the Senate who said no to this was Senator Lisa Murkowski. And hey, Democrats, you should probably know that Senator Cory Booker, he said yes to this, to Kushner being our ambassador to France. So much for the resistance being united against Trump's absolute ridiculous corruption of our government. Michael Duffy. He is now going to be our Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. So this is a guy who has enormous power over where our tax dollars go towards the weapons manufacturers. And this guy served in the Office of Management and Budget during Donald Trump's first term. And he was one of the officials who ordered approximately $391 million in weapons to be withheld from Ukraine. And that was a move that was determined to be illegal by the Government Accountability Office. And it was a move that got Donald Trump impeached. And then during the impeachment process, Michael Duffy ignored a congressional subpoena. And so that is interpreted as loyalty. And I think that is why he is now going to be passing out our tax dollars to the military-industrial complex. That is quite the promotion. This confirmation was done on the party line vote. All Republicans, yes. All Democrats and independents, no. But they were outnumbered. So we now have Michelle Bowman, who is the vice chairman for supervision of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System, if you haven't heard my episode, WTF is the Federal Reserve. The creation of this thing was kind of a scandal, but it's quasi-governmental, kind of private sector. It's always staffed by bankers. So you kind of have like foxes in the hen house, and they're supposed to be our banking police, or at least we have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which the Republicans are trying to eliminate from existence. And so really the Federal Reserve is where the banking policing really is. And so the vice chairman for supervision, that's supervision of the banks. This is an incredibly important regulator in the United States, if not the most important banking cop that we have. And this woman, Michelle Bowman, she's a problem because she doesn't seem to believe that the banks really need to be policed. And so, like, for example, she's against a lot of the rules that were put in place against the banks after 2008, after the banks crashed the entire world economy with reckless gambling and giving loans to people that couldn't possibly pay stuff back, but they were collecting fees, and then they would play hot potato with the loans. I mean, the entire banking system became a giant scandal. And then when the banks had to pay their own loans, they didn't have enough cash. And that's one of the reasons that whole thing happened. And so the Wall Street financial reform part of that was you need to have more actual cash to cover your bets. And this woman, Michelle Bowman, doesn't think that they should have to hold even that much cash. And she's also said that banks have too many unnecessary costs imposed on them due to regulations, as if the banks are not profitable enough. Like, what are you talking about, lady? Now we have a dude named James O'Neill, who is our Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services. And this guy, so he's an investor and he has no medical training whatsoever. And that didn't stop the George W. Bush administration from giving him positions in Health and Human Services. So he's been in that department before. But since the George W. Bush administration, he has moved on to the private sector and has basically been a servant to billionaire Peter Thiel. And so Peter Thiel owns a therapeutics company, and he hired this guy, James O'Neill, to essentially run it. And James O'Neill has publicly advocated for the government to allow people to take drugs that have been deemed to be safe, but not necessarily effective by the Food and Drug Administration. As it is now, FDA will approve drugs if they are safe and effective. And so essentially the way I see this guy is an advocate for legitimizing the sales of snake oil. And I'm especially concerned about this because James O'Neill is on the board of directors of Advantage Therapeutics. That is the Peter Thiel company. And they've been working on an Alzheimer's drug that is still like being tested, but they're going to need that drug approved by the FDA before it can be sold and profited from. And so basically, I see this as a way for James O'Neill to be in a position to help his own company, the company that he's on the board of. I mean, I don't know if he's still on the board. I didn't check to see if he resigned, but still, like, he has this connection to this company. So he's in a position now to help them get their drugs approved easier, even if the companies haven't proved that their drugs work. So major red flags with him. The Republicans don't give a shit. They voted unanimously for him, 52-43. All Republicans, yes. All Democrats, no. And so now RFK has this guy as his number 2. And then we also have a new assistant attorney general. This guy's name is John Andrew Eisenberg. He was an associate deputy attorney general during the torturing, spying, and illegal war starting George W. Bush administration. So that's not great. And then he was also involved in the Trump the first administration. And so he was the deputy counsel to the president for national security affairs. And in that role, he tried to hide the Ukraine phone call that Trump was impeached for by calling it highly classified and putting it on a server that no one could access. Obviously, that didn't work. And then he instructed subordinates to not discuss it with anyone, including members of Congress. And then to show even further disrespect to Congress, he then ignored a congressional subpoena during the impeachment inquiry. So this guy has been proven to be loyal to Trump, wishy-washy with laws, and now he is our assistant attorney general. We now have a deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And this dude, his name is David Fatui, and he was in the APA in Trump's first term. And while he was there, he advocated for, example, labeling landfills and ponds that were full of coal ash as clean, even though they clearly were not, as a favor to the coal industry. Then he left the EPA, went to the private sector, and he was paid lots of money to help companies sue the EPA. So, for example, he fought the EPA's ban on asbestos, which causes mesothelioma. If you watch, I don't know, Law and Order in the middle of the day, or even the Weather Channel, like anything in the middle of the day, you're going to see commercials for these lawyers that are helping people with mesothelioma, which came from asbestos. And this guy was on the asbestos side of that. He also represented a tire company that allegedly polluted streams and killed endangered salmon. He represented a group of businesses that wanted to lower water quality standards in Washington state. And when you look at the people that want him to be in the EPA, he's supported by industry and agriculture groups like the National Cattlemen's Association, which really doesn't want to have to pay to properly dispose of all the cow shit that they produce. So this guy is a problem. And he is now the deputy administrator of the EPA. So sucks for everyone who likes clean air and water. He was confirmed by all of the Republicans, 53-41. All the Democrats and independents said no. We also now have a new Federal Communications Commission commissioner. Her name is Olivia Trusty, and this is a person who, her nomination is actually more controversial than the other guy, but it doesn't seem to have that much to do with her. So this woman was a Republican policy director in the Senate Commerce Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. So the people in the Senate know this woman. She is now going to be the third commissioner out of 5 seats on the Federal Communication Commission. Now, there were only 2 out of 5 until now. And so that meant that there wasn't a quorum, which meant that the FCC was really quite literally dysfunctional. So now that there are 3 people out of 5 who are on the commission, they can start working again, and the Republicans control it 2-1. But what usually happens, this has been one of those norms, it's not a law or anything, but it's just what usually happens. Usually the president would appoint a Republican one and then would also have a Democratic person at the same time. Trump is refusing to appoint a Democratic member. So that is why the Democrats voted in unison against her. It wasn't really about her. It was more about the makeup of the commission. Because now that the Republicans have control of it and that Trump is refusing to appoint anyone from the other side to make this a truly bipartisan commission, well, that means the Federal Communication Commission is now industry friendly because you have this lady on there, and then the other Republican who's the chair of the commission is Brendan Carr, and he's promised deregulation of the communications industry. And so what people are afraid of is more industry consolidation. We also had the confirmation of Brian Bedford, who is now our new Federal Aviation Administration administrator. And this guy was an airline CEO for 26 years. It's not an airline that most of us are probably familiar with. It's Republic Airways. It sounds like it sounds like they had smaller airplanes. It's not like American Airlines. But the point here is that he was the CEO, and now he's going to be the police of the industry that he was a CEO in. And one of the concerns that people have is during his time as a CEO, he was lobbying Congress to cut in half the number of hours that were required for pilots and co-pilots to have to be physically trained before they could be licensed to fly. And so this guy, there's a lot of concerns about his priorities. A lot of people, myself included, are concerned that he will prioritize profits over safety. And you can just kind of like look at who's supporting him. The airlines supported his nomination, but he was opposed by the families of crash victims and by Sully Sullenberger, who is the American hero, the pilot who landed on the Hudson River and saved everybody's lives on that plane. I mean, we all know who Sully Sullenberger is. And he was able to do that because of his extensive training. And so he actually was very vocal against this guy, Brian Bedford, being the FAA administrator. But the Republicans, they also seem to be fine with profit over safety. And so this guy's nomination was confirmed 53-43. All Republicans, yes. All Democrats and independents were no's. We now have a new head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This guy was just confirmed for 5 years, so his term is going to go until June of 2030. His name is David Wright. And David Wright, well, first of all, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, if you don't know, is a supposed to be independent regulatory agency that regulates commercial nuclear power plants. But Donald Trump is clearly making the commission less independent. He recently fired Democratic member of the commission, so he wants it to be more Republican. And the reason he's stacking it with Republicans is because he's essentially trying to let the nuclear industry capture their regulator. And the reason I say that is because President Trump signed an executive order that demanded the agency consider making its safety standards less stringent, suggested shortening the timelines for environmental reviews, and a quadrupling of the nation's nuclear power capacity by 2050. And so I know there's quite a few people in this audience that every time I say the word nuclear have to write in a message about how nuclear is great and we shouldn't be afraid of it, da, 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 da. But you are never, ever, ever going to make me and the millions of people like me who know that the Fukushima disaster happened and 3 Mile Island happened and Chernobyl happened. Like, there are some very serious risks with this kind of nuclear power. And so to see that this administration is trying to push forward with that much nuclear power by loosening the safety standards, this is not going to gain any support for nuclear power. I know I am heading away from it more and more with this administration. But that is what they're choosing to do. And the problem with David Wright is he seems willing to implement those less stringent safety standards and to weaken environmental reviews for a very dangerous form of energy. It doesn't go wrong often, but when it does, we are talking about uninhabitable cities for generations. And so this guy was confirmed. The Republicans are fine with loosening safety standards for nuclear power because they all voted yes, and all of the Democrats and independents voted no, but the Republicans had the votes. And so this guy is now the head of the commission. So we now have a new United States Circuit Judge for the Third Circuit. This is a lifetime appointment, and the guy's name is Emil Bove III. And this guy is a problem. So this is the guy that, as New York Deputy Attorney General, dismissed the corruption charges against Mayor Eric Adams. The concern was that Eric Adams was given a pass in exchange for helping with Trump's immigration raids. And then a DOJ whistleblower alleged that in March of 2025, Bove told DOJ lawyers to ignore court orders. The whistleblower says that Bove said "fuck you" to judges in order to proceed with immigration deportations. Like, that was his order to those under him to say "fuck you" to judges. And apparently the Democrats had documents to back up those claims. What I find really gross about what's going on in Congress is the Democrats wanted this whistleblower to testify, and I think this is pretty important testimony. But the head of the Judiciary Committee, who is Senator from Iowa, Chuck Grassley, he wouldn't allow this testimony. So this guy was not heard. Also disturbing is that more than 900 former DOJ attorneys and 75 former judges publicly claimed that Bove prioritizes loyalty to Trump over legal norms. This was one of the more controversial nominations that I've seen. The Intercept had a whole article on this guy. He is bad, bad news. And now he has a lifetime appointment on the appeals court. So that's just, ugh. And actually with this one, there were actually 2 Republicans who said no. So it was all Democrats, independents, and then Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins were all no's on this nomination, but he still got through by a vote of 50-49. So we now have an assistant attorney general. His name is Thomas Geiser. And this is another guy who's now significant. He's actually quite younger than me. This guy was only born in 1989. He clerked for Samuel Alito, who is one of the more conservative Supreme Court justices. And this guy, huge red flags. So this kid was one of Trump's lawyers who helped Trump with his election certification fraud after the election of 2020. Specifically, he was involved in writing a memo saying that Vice President Mike Pence could refuse to certify the legitimate electors, which he could not. And then in his confirmation hearing, Thomas Geiser refused to answer any questions about this. So he's a Trump loyalist. He's now the assistant attorney general. I do worry. I mean, Trump is breaking so many laws and he's putting people in office that are just never, ever going to prosecute him for anything as long as they're in power. We also now have a new director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Office of the Director of National Intelligence. His name is Joseph Kent, and he's been in the military a long time. He did 11 Army deployments, and he also worked for the CIA, so he's got his qualifications as a spook. He did try and become a politician. He ran twice as a Republican for Congress in Washington State, but he lost both times. And more recently, he's been Tulsi Gabbard's chief of staff now that she's the director of national intelligence. But the problem with this guy and why all Democrats and independents voted against him is that he said that the FBI was responsible for the January 6th bumpkin riot. Like anyone could tell those idiots what to do. And he also said that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, which is it's a lie. We know that's a lie. And then also, as Tulsi Gabbard's chief of staff, he wanted to change an intelligence report because he didn't like what it said. So basically, the report concluded that the Venezuelan government was not directing Venezuelan gangs here in the United States. And he wanted the intelligence community to change that report to get it to say that Venezuelan government was involved here in the United States because they want to use the Alien Enemies Act in their immigration and deportation justifications. But the facts didn't line up with that. And so he just wanted to get the report to lie. So all kinds of red flags about this asshole. But he was confirmed by all the Republicans who just don't seem to mind these ethical issues. 52 Republican yeses to 44 Democratic and independent noes. So that is what the Republicans have been up to in our Congress. So now let's look at the Democrats, who obviously have no power, but they did do something significant over the last 8 months, and that is literally die, because 3 of them so far have died in office. So on March 5th, Sylvester Turner of Houston, Texas, died at the age of 70 after serving in Congress for 61 days. He had been elected to replace Sheila Jackson Lee, who had also died in office of old age. Then 8 days later, Raul Grijalva, Democrat of Arizona, died at age 77. Now, Raul Grijalva knew he had lung cancer in April of 2024. Plenty of time to let someone else who was younger and healthier run for his seat, but he did not step aside and died in office instead, leaving his seat vacant. And then about 10 weeks later, Gerald Connolly died at the age of 75. And that selfish son of a bitch knew he had cancer, but didn't tell anyone until after he had been reelected in November of 2024. And he's another one who intended to occupy his seat part-time because he was undergoing treatment while in office, so not at work, and who said that he wouldn't run again in 2026, but he died in May of 2025 instead, with more than a year and a half left in this Congress. And here's why I have no sympathy whatsoever for these men. because their selfishness had dire consequences for the entire country. Because the first version of the Big Beautiful Bill, which, like I said before, is the worst law I have ever read in the almost 13 years that I've been the host of Congressional Dish, well, the first version of it passed the House by a vote of 215 to 214. It passed by only one vote. And so had these men thought of the country instead of their own careers and allowed healthy younger people to serve in those seats, that version of the bill could have been stopped in its tracks. And who knows how it could have been changed with that leverage, the damage that could have been prevented. And those seats, they're still vacant right now. There's going to be special elections, which cost us taxpayers money to hold, but there's going to be 2 special elections in September and 1 in November to replace them. But the government funding crisis, it's here now, and those seats are going to be vacant for most of it. And in a House of Representatives with such a tight margin, having seriously ill elderly people occupy those seats, it's just unforgivable. And there are more Democrats who are doing this. So Representative Dwight Evans of Pennsylvania, he's 71 years old, and he had a stroke last year. This happened months before the election in which he ran unopposed, but he kept running. He missed literally hundreds of votes, and yet he still occupies that seat. And he's another one who said he won't run again in 2026, but he's staying put for now. And then there's Representative David Scott of Georgia. He's 79 years old, and it's a well-circulated rumor that his brain has pretty much melted. He reads from scripts and he can't meaningfully participate in policy discussions anymore, and the Democrats even removed him from one of his committee chairmanships. And right now, he's planning to run again in 2026. And I don't understand why the party isn't telling him, here's the door. And so as for the Democrats, I think that's something that they need to work on. Basically just staying alive. It's the least they could do. And as for independents, there is one thing that I do want to point out that happened. This was a failed attempt. This is not something that became law. But I am of the opinion that what we are participating in Gaza is a horrific injustice. It is something that is against everything I stand for as an American and a human being, because we're at the point now that every hospital in Gaza has been destroyed. They are taking full residential areas and just blowing up all the buildings. There are people that are now actively starving. The people who make these determinations have said that we have gone from a campaign of starvation to a full-blown famine in Gaza, and we are paying for this, and we are buying the bombs that Israel is using, and we continue to send them. And so we have one independent senator from Vermont. You may have heard of him. His name is Bernie Sanders. And he tried to stop our weapons from going to Israel. Now, like I said, his effort failed. Our members of Congress are still very much on board with supporting this whole, I'm going to say it, genocide, because that is what all of the people, the organizations that determine what is and is not a genocide, they have all said it is a genocide that Israel is perpetrating over there. And like, the goal is to steal the land. The goal is to have this thing called Greater Israel. Like, you can look this up. Right now, the Palestinians are occupying land that Israelis say is theirs. And so I don't think that they necessarily want to murder all the people of Gaza, but they want them to leave. Although they're not letting them leave and go anywhere else. So there's also that. And so they're just killing them instead. But the way that you know that this is what's happening, the mask off, is what's happening in the West Bank. Kind of mentioned this before when we talked about Mike Huckabee, but in the West Bank, there is no Hamas. And so the excuse is always like, well, the hostages, well, Hamas. There is no hostages and there is no Hamas in the West Bank, and they are continuing to violently steal land in the West Bank. That's how you know the mask is off. That's how you know this is a giant land grab. They think that land belongs to them because of God. And so when you look at it that way, this isn't just a dispute amongst neighbors. They're trying to make those neighbors disappear. And so when I use the word genocide, I think that that needs to be factored in, that the goal here is to have only Jewish people and compliant Palestinians living on that land. And every Palestinian who says, you know, we've been living here for hundreds of years, like we should get to live here too, they are either being eliminated or moved out of the land. It matters. And so members of our Congress in both parties are still very much supporting this. And so what Bernie Sanders tried to do was stop the export of so-called defense articles. Those are weapons to Israel. And while his effort failed, the vote was 27-70. Now, the last time that those votes were taken, there were not 27 people in the Senate who supported cutting off weapons to Israel. And so I think the point that I just want to make here is that it's going in the right direction. The tide is turning against Israel, against sending, weapons to Israel to do this to the Palestinians. And so, yes, it failed, but support is going in the right direction. And so I do want to let you know that every single person who voted in favor of cutting off weapons to Israel, they were Democrats and both independents. So Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine, they both voted for this. And so it's moving in the right direction, but there is still an enormous amount of blood on our hands, and we still need to be fighting as hard as we possibly can to get this Congress to stop funding such a horrendous human rights. I hate to even call it a human rights abuse because it's horrific. It's horrific what we are participating in, and I want to desperately stop. And so, keep calling because it is changing minds in the Senate. Your calls do matter. Okay. So you are going to hear this right before Labor Day, and after Labor Day, Congress is going to come back, and that is when we are going to get into government funding crisis mode because the government needs to be funded by September 30th. Right now, 1 out of the 12 government funding bills has been signed into law. And there is a snowball's chance in hell that they are going to finish the other 11 on time because, quite frankly, they haven't even tried. And so what's going to happen at the end of this month, just like happens all the time, is that they're going to have to either pass a continuing resolution, which is going to just keep the current funding levels going forward, or they're going to have to finish all 11 bills. So it's probably going to be a continuing resolution. Republicans are constantly fighting with themselves over the continuing resolution. And when this happened the last time in March, there were a lot of Democrats who thought it was a brilliant idea to shut the government down, despite the fact that every time the Republicans had shut the government down in the past, it always went against the Republicans. But the Democrats, in their infinite wisdom, want to take that failed tactic and use it themselves. Now, there were, I believe, 9 senators who stood in the way of that stupid plan and kept the government open, which is important because when you shut the government down, you give Donald Trump more power, not less, to decide what gets to stay open. And this is a man who has been very open with the fact that they want to slash our government. And so it would be playing into their hands. If you want more details on this, and if you want to remember exactly what went down in March, you should listen to my episode called Democratic Deception. That's the story of our last government funding crisis that happened back in March. And I really am terrified that there are going to be different decisions made this time because too many Democrats think that shutting down the government gives them leverage or some other bullshit. So I am nervous about this upcoming fall. I think we should all be nervous because we are not in good hands with either of these parties. And brace yourselves because here we go. But no matter what happens, I will be here to at least let you know about it so that you can protect yourselves and your families and so that we can make our mental notes for what damage to undo when we finally get the chance. All right. So I would like to, before I wrap this up, thank our executive producers. These are people that helped me pay for the production of the Big Beautiful Bill episode. So thank you, Jean Vasquez. Jean has been supporting this show forever. I love Jean. And so Jean sent in a message that said, longtime listener and contributor, I have about 5 executive producer credits available. And if possible, I would like to add a credit to the upcoming Big Beautiful Bill episode. If you could attribute the credit to my wonderful rescue dog, Penny Lane Murder Paws, that would be totally awesome. And yes, we would happily do that. Once on Congressional 206 thank you episode, you gave a shout out to my since passed dog, Maxwell Fuzzington of the Fuzzingtons. And it brings me a little joy to know that his name exists out there digitally and in the minds of everyone that listens to that episode. I'm sorry for your loss. I know how much you love your pups. Jean said, I listened to the BBB episode Walking Penny this morning, and I do agree with you that the cruelty isn't intentionally baked into the process. Please keep up the good work of keeping everyone informed on what the government is actually doing instead of what they say they're doing. I have attached a picture of Penny during one of her many walks. She's cute, but you never know when she's going to try to unalive you. Feel free to use the picture if it helps to promote the show in any way. Thank you. Love the show. Jean Vasquez. And yes, thank you for the picture. Penny is a beautiful pup. I love that you send me the pictures of your dog. I am always down for a good dog picture. They always make me happy. So thank you. And thank you for putting an executive producer credit on the second BBB episode. And also, I would like to thank Stephen McMahon, also a longtime supporter of this show and someone that I kind of consider one of my favorite pen pals at this point. He also put one of his executive producer credits on Congressional Dish 321. So it is moving up the ranks of the most valuable episodes, as it should, because I consider both of those episodes to be incredibly valuable, even though they were a real bitch to produce. But I am very lucky. And the only reason I got those episodes out in less than like 6 months is because of the team that I have here at Congressional Dish. So thank you, Claire. She was my production and research assistant. She was super helpful going back through the Last Week in Congress episodes and telling me what the most interesting stuff was so that I could produce this episode for you. Thank you, Mike at Pro Podcast Solution. He is our editor. Thank you, Mark at podcastbranding.co. He does our web design and security. Thank you to my sister, Lauren, who is our bookkeeper and executive producer services specialist, which is a title we totally made up, but it's what she does. So that's her title. I'd also like to thank my dad who does my taxes. And I'd always like to thank Brian Karras. He was our artist for many years. He is dearly departed, but we love and miss you. And every time I use ChatGPT to do the episode level art, I like to think that you are involved in being the wizard that is giving us our art even to this day. So yeah, love you, Brian. And that's it for today. I'll be back in September to tell you what they're going to do to us now. Happy Labor Day. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.